Okay, so we're going to move on to lesson 5, which is called whole note. The next 4 lessons, including this one, actually all just go a little bit deeper into the actual note values themselves: whole note, half note, quarter note, eighth note. So we're going to have plenty of opportunities to review and reinforce the note value material. So we're just going to delve right in here to lesson 5. All right, so as always, we're going to start with review, especially because we're in these early stages of just sort of learning the terms that we're going to need to be able to start talking about music in a clear way. So we have the musical staff, and we learn that that consists of 5 lines and 4 spaces. We count them from the bottom to the top. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines and 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces. If I were to draw an X on line 4, it would look like this: 1, 2, 3, and I would draw an X right over top of line 4. If I wanted to draw an X in space 1, I would just draw an X like that right in space 1. We learn that we usually have a clef at the leftmost side of the staff, and one of the clefs we learned is a treble clef or a G clef. Remember that we started that if we want to draw it on line 2, bump up to line 3, down to line 1, up and around, back down. And the reason it's called the G clef is because that a code is embedded into any clef sign, and that code, in this case, is all the curlicue action around line 2. If we were to draw a note head right on line 2, this note or this pitch would be a G, and from there we'd be able to decode all the other pitches on the staff so we know which pitches to play or sing. Remember that a treble clef is usually used for the right hand of the piano, let's say, for any of the higher instruments, strings and winds especially, well, actually upper strings, and also for soprano and alto voices, female voices, right? So the treble clef or the G clef. We also learned that we have a bass clef. There's a couple other clefs too, but these are the 2 we are going to learn about that are most common for us. We started on line 4, we bump up to line 5 and draw basically half a heart, stopping just under line 2. We draw a dot beside it, 1 in space 4, 1 in space 3, and these 3 dots are the code embedded in this particular clef that give it its name. It's called an F clef because if we put a note head on line 4, X marks the spot, right? These 3 dots all indicate line 4 is important. That note would be an F, and from there we could decode all the other pitches or letter names on the staff. We will, of course, get into this in much more detail when we actually learn to read pitches, but for now this is going to be enough. So bass clef or F clef. So again, we're going to review our note value pyramid. The longest note in Western music is called a whole note, and it looks like an open note head. We could think of it as being equivalent to a whole pie. We can take that whole note, we can break it into 2 equal parts. When we do that, we take that same open note head, but we add a stem to it, and we call these half notes because each of them is going to be worth half the value of a whole note, half the duration of a whole note. We can take that half note and we can break it into 2 parts, and what we're going to do is just fill in that note head. That'll help us remember that we're 1 level down, we're 1 level of note shorter, and we can call these quarter notes because each of them will just get a quarter of the value, a quarter of the duration that a whole note would get. We can take these quarter notes and we can break them into what we'll call eighth notes. Eighth notes look just like quarter notes, except they have either, I'll just draw it over here, a single flag hanging off of them, or we take those flags and we just connect them together and we call this a beam, a single beam. Again, remember that you can have 2, 3, 4 of them connected depending on the rules that govern that particular score. That's, again, getting into theory. Doesn't really matter. You just need to know that you're looking for a single beam to help us know that that is an eighth note. Single beam or single flag. I won't go ahead and do all of these. Okay, so here's, again, single beam. Oops, sorry. So a quarter note, quarter of a pi, right? And an eighth note worth an eighth of a whole pi, or an eighth of the duration of a whole note. Okay, and then we could take these eighth notes and we can break them into 2 equal parts, and these are going to be called 16th notes, and they look just like an eighth note, right? So a quarter note with a flag, but they're going to be given another flag. Or we can take most commonly 4 strung together, sometimes 2, sometimes 6, sometimes 3, all sorts of different, it depends on the piece or song. And then we have 2 beams, right? 2 beams or 2 flags, and those are 16th notes, and each of those will be given the duration of a 16th of a whole note. So they'll be just a 16th of the duration, or a 16th of the value of a whole note. All right, so if you'll remember that the most important thing to keep in mind when we're looking at note values and trying to understand what information we can glean from them is that until they are attached to a score that contains additional decoding information from a composer, the only thing we can be certain of, the only thing we can ascribe to them is that they have a fixed relative value, meaning a whole note will be twice as long as a half note will be twice as long as a quarter note will be twice as long as an eighth note, and an eighth note will be twice as long as a 16th note. All right, so to conclude this review portion of Lesson 5, I'd actually like to return to Lesson 4, the part we kind of jumped away from when I was actually teaching Lesson 4. So this just goes through some music math examples, and hopefully now this will make sense to you. So what they're doing is just giving us lots of different scenarios of things that would be equivalent. So we can know that 1 whole note would be equal to 2 half notes, right? Which would be equal to 4 quarter notes, which would be equal to 8 eighth notes. And then they just go through that again. 1 half note could be equal to 2 quarter notes. It could also be equal to 4 eighth notes, right? All worth the same duration, okay? 1 quarter note would fill the same duration as 2 eighth notes. These are things we can know for certain. You'll notice again the absence of specific beat allotments, specific duration allotments. They're not trying to be obscure or trying to withhold information. It's because it literally cannot be assigned to these notes until we're actually given decoding information from a composer on a score. And they will assign a specific number of beats, and then we can figure out the actual number of beats that we should give to each of these different note values, okay? But we can't know that until we're actually looking at a score. And then they go through one other way of showing the length of these notes is actually just to kind of show the duration. Sometimes I use rulers with kids just to show them, you know, if a whole note is 4 inches, then a half note would be 2 inches, and a quarter note would be 1 inch, and an eighth note would be half an inch. You can do like things like that, can be helpful just to sort of visualize it, right? And understand at another level the length, the duration of these notes relative to each other. Again, that's the only thing that is fixed at this point, is each of these notes holds a fixed relative value. All right, so for Lesson 5, we're actually just going to talk a little bit more about a whole note, so this should be pretty brief. We'll just read through this together. This is a whole note. A whole note is the longest note we learned in the last lesson, and the whole note is the easiest to draw. Just draw an oval like this, trace the whole note shown below, then draw 5 whole notes to the right of the note you trace. So obviously they just want us to go through and do this and draw 5 more whole notes. One other way of writing notes that some kids learn is to do that and then that, right? And it's a little bit easier for some kids than drawing it in one fell swoop. Again, this is not necessary at all, but you may find doing a little bit of this just really helps cement things into your mind. Writing is always helpful, obviously, as a tool for learning and cementing learning. So whole notes look like this on a staff, right? And you'll notice already now we see, first of all, a treble clef, right? Because that's what's needed to decode which pitches these note heads will represent. It does talk about that when a whole note is in a space, it fills the space from top to bottom like this. So this is, if again you're practicing this, you want to make sure that a space note genuinely is in a space. So you don't want to see that because that's kind of confusing. Is that a note on line 3, or is that a space note on space 2? So you want to make sure it's sort of contained, but that it fills that area out well. When it's on a line, it is centered on the line like this. So similarly, you don't want to draw like that because we don't know, is that note supposed to be here on space 3, or is it supposed to be here on line 3? So, and you can look at your scores now that you know this information and just see, usually, obviously anything computer generated is just going to be so accurate in that. And it's one of the things that makes it really easy to read music nowadays compared to when we're sometimes thrown a pop score written by hand. It can be a lot trickier. Trace the first whole note below, then draw 5 more whole notes anywhere on the staff. So again, he just wants you to have some experience of drawing some of these note heads, right? Obviously, I've had to write my fair share of theory assignments, so it might look like I'm just blazing through those. You get faster at them and more accurate, just like you do with writing letters. All right, and since many of you will not be doing any of this written work, we're just going to go through this together in the video, so at least you see what we would be doing. This is the second page of the Lesson 5 whole note review. So he asks you to circle all of the whole notes in the staff, right? So obviously this is going to be a half note, so I'm not going to circle that. This is a whole note, right? Just a plain open note head. This would actually be an 8th note because it is the single flag note, right? This is going to be a half note again because it has the stem in addition to the open note head. This is a quarter note. Here's our whole note, and here's another quarter note. Draw a whole note on the line or in the space shown below. So let's go through this. This is obviously in the first space. On the third line would be 1, 2, and then 3. In the second space is going to be 1, 2. On the fifth line is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. In the fourth space would be 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then on which line or in which space have these whole notes been placed, right? So he wants us to write that in, sorry. So second space, this will be third line, right? Fourth space, always counting from the bottom, first line, and third space. Are these whole notes in the treble clef or the bass clef? Circle the correct answer, right? And obviously, we're all pros now, treble clef, or we could call that a G clef, right? Just to review that. A bass clef would be called also an F clef, okay? So we know already that this is a G, because remember that curly Q action is going to help us know that. That's why it's called a G clef. All right, that's it for today.